It's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce Dr. Marianne Hunter now to give her response to Ron's keynote. Marianne is Associate Head of Education and Assistant Dean of Transformative Learning and Teaching in the College of Arts, Law and Education at the University of Tasmania. Wow, fancy having an actual assistant dean in transformation. I think that's fabulous. Marianne also focuses on the role of the arts and creative practice in education and applied settings. And she teaches and supervises in the fields of arts education, creative practice, and peace and conflict studies. And lots of us know well Marianne's work across a whole range of disciplines, and also her work in curious schools. Welcome, Marianne. We're all keen to hear your response.
Thanks so much for that, Robyn. I also want to just acknowledge that we're moving into the middle of the day here, and to acknowledge the wonderful opportunity that I have here in Lutruwita, Tasmania, to live and work on country. I commit here to honour many ways of knowing, and to convey my respect for all elders past, present and future, because these lands always have been and always will be Aboriginal lands. So thank you again. This is it's been so invigorating to listen this morning, Ron, and to be here with everyone. And I wanted to just start with something that I really just wanted to be present and curious to what would rise for me now. So I invite you to a couple of minutes reflection with Mary Oliver. I worried a lot. Will the garden grow? Will the rivers flow in the right direction? Will the earth turn as it was taught? And if not, how shall I correct it? Was I right? Was I wrong? Will I be forgiven? Can I do better? Will I ever be able to sing? Even the sparrows can do it. And I am, well, hopeless. Is my eyesight fading, or am I just imagining it? Am I going to get rheumatism, lockjaw, dementia? Finally, I saw that worrying had come to nothing and gave it up, and took my old body out and went out into the morning and sang. I share this as Ron's invitation to rethink our relationship with uncertainty, and for his invitation here, I think, to engage in profound moments of uncertainty. And as Ron also kind of shared, we're all engaging with a very different kind of uncertainty than what we may have theorised or thought about previously when it comes to education and to schooling. It's a kind of profound sense of human uncertainty that we have collectively experienced, I guess, as humans. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and pick up the number of times, I guess, we were tapping into questions of how to manage that uncertainty, and how can we find that sweet spot in an educational context about the great dilemma of our age, which I think is trying to manage that human urge for certainty while at the same time developing the skills to live without it, and to enabling that space in the schooling and classroom and with children to feel a certain safety in engaging with that uncertainty. So that's what I wanted to kind of play with in resonance with Ron's invitation here, and kind of extend the conversation a little bit into what does this ask of us as educators. And what really resonated here was the responsibility to cultivate the conditions for encountering uncertainty. I love that sense of to unplan the overplanned, and it really resonated with ideas and concepts and practices and invitations and discomforts about unlearning. So what does it mean to learn through an unlearning? Another question that resonated there was also, how do we develop the stamina to sit in the moment, to step in the gap? And what we have here, I think, with Ron's offering is the legacy challenge, which brings educators into a really dynamic relationship with uncertainty, but helps to manage that uncertainty and that anxiousness in ourselves as educators. And the great gift of Ron's work here is this kind of arrival at a simplicity beyond the complexity. And I think it's kind of gold. It's very, very helpful in when we're working with educators and teachers and supporting the work of schooling at this time. And and when I say simplicity beyond complexity, I guess I'm tapping into that idea that we have a lot of quick fixes that are dropping into our inboxes. And many of those quick fixes could also be described as simple, but they're simple because they're novel. And they're novel and we try them out and we do all the what ifs. But what we have here is the simplicity beyond the complexity. And that's a much more profound and useful way of kind of working with some of these questions, because it offers us ourselves as educators that sweet spot of working with that uncertainty while helping to develop the skills to live without it. It offers us a scaffold as educators. So thank you, Ron. It's great to be thinking with this and to looking at these really valuable, practical implications and opportunities it provides us. So here I want to continue with some of those resonances here, with creativity, with artist practices in particular, and in education, to do some question making with you and to sit together with me in the learning. So this isn't about kind of learning from, but learning with. And this is the kind of shift that I've been, I guess, working with in the ways that we manage some of these opportunities that Ron talks about in terms of creating maps for students. So, of course, my first thought went to process drama, and I know there's a number of people with us, I'm sitting with today in our various locations who are virtuosic in their understandings of process drama. But that idea of the scaffolding, the incredible resource and traditions that process drama offers us to bring both the effect and the affect of learning with each other in education in a very collaborative way, and in a way that shifts from being reciprocal learning into relational learning. And what I see here is a resource and an opportunity to kind of even think more about the value of those approaches that process drama has offered us in this space, and how that might map on some of this of these ideas around problem searching or problem finding. It also sort of taps into the artist's gifts of being unteacherly and of raising a new normal of working productively with ambiguity. And this is, I guess, resonant with some of the work that Gert Giest has done. And ironically, he also has some research around the beautiful risk of education. And in response to his, I guess, engagements with these questions about ambiguity and uncertainty, I also saw in here our opportunity for teachers to be really thinking with artists about what are the gifts of being unteacherly. And when I say the unteacherly, it does come back to Ron's invitation to us to be thinking about how much and how far the predetermined determines our work with students. And it's a question that's in a way unanswerable because there are so many what ifs, and it actually kind of inspires a creativity in myself and my own thinking, and how we might invite pre-service educators, which is the space I'm working in at the moment, how we invite those pre-service educators to sort of unlearn, to unravel safely their perceptions of what education is and their perceptions of what a teacher might be, I think is really important work to be done in and around these offerings that Ron has to make here. And I'm also thinking of curiosity and creativity in this space. Robyn mentioned before the Curious Schools work. Curious Schools actually began as a project where we were looking to make creativity visible in Tasmanian schools, because often we were seeing that the creativity that might happen in a school was often the stuff that was lauded in the touring shows of the students' best work that would go around the state, and absolutely virtuosic work, terrific work. But what was the creativity that was sitting behind some of that work, embedded within that work, and that might not be defined as successful in the ways that those touring exhibitions of excellent work were considered successful? And the interesting thing we found is that when we start having these conversations with teachers, as soon as we brought the word creativity up, it was like, oh no, I'm not creative. Oh no, I wouldn't call myself creative. And there was a real sense of capital C creativity in their thinking. But once we started asking, and here it was quite a kind of delight to hear their responses to our question when it shifted. So when we shifted our questions as researchers and as supporters of these teachers in their work, we said, well, what are you curious about in your work? And of course, as soon as the teachers began to reflect with a different frame about their practices in the classroom, what we as researchers might have assessed as creativity, as the sorts of aspects and dispositions that that Ron was speaking about today, about being creative within a task, or offering the opportunity of creativity within constraints, is what these teachers were doing every single day. But it was how the invitation for them to talk about what they were curious about was how it surfaced in their discussions with us. So I think in the Australian context, it's a noticing around our discourses around creativity, our discourses around uncertainty, and the way we speak and act and reflect on what it means to be creative and what it means to kind of engage with the certain and the uncertain. Because for many, many educators, as much as many students, certainty equals safety. So what does it mean to be safe? What does it mean to be culturally safe? And how can we extend our thinking and extend the invitation that Ron has offered us here about rethinking our relationship with uncertainty within those frameworks of safety? What is the question making that we can bring to our work as educators to not just change the environment, but help a transformative process of learning with each other in safe sorts of ways? And for me, it always comes back to presence. So not the idea of being present, because of course in online teaching, for example, being present might mean for some people being at elbow support. It might not be necessarily about having presence, which is very much can be kind of advantageous, but it's actually a question of presence. In what ways are we supporting pre-service educators in particular and our colleagues working in the school environment to cultivate the conditions of uncertainty, which Ron mentioned at the beginning? And how might we be supporting them to ground themselves in presence in the classroom, to enable the curiosity to flourish, to enable those moments of question making to come, and to be using scaffoldings, the simplicity beyond the complexity, to guide that process, but to still remain present to the needs of those students for whom certainty equals safety. because uncertainty will be different, as I think a number of you in the chat had mentioned. Uncertainty and the levels of uncertainty can be very different for different students. So how are we creative in that safety making? And so I guess I just want to, I want to sort of wrap that up, or wrap that into some discussion there about sharing a story. And I'm a little uncertain myself about whether to share it, because it's happened quite recently. And it's a story that picks up, I guess, on some of these questions, and also the question of assessment, which I really invite people to think about in this space. And that is, last week, my son is one of my children is a venturer. So a venturer is like a scout group, but for older kids. He's very much an outdoors person, and it's helped him develop many of the skills, those discipline skills, the certain skills that you might need to survive in the bush. So last weekend, he wasn't on the walk, but the rest of his venturer group were. And one of their scout masters or scout leaders suffered a heart attack. We found out later it was a massive heart attack. And last night I was at a debriefing session as the group came to unite again, the venturers who were there and the venturers who weren't. And the venturers who had been there had gone through together, learning with each other through a kind of a group counselling process. But last night was about coming together to reintegrate. So they told some of their stories about what happened and shared it in a way that was, you know, really very helpful for everybody and beautifully managed. But the interesting thing that that one of the other parents shared with me was one of her daughter's experiences at school, and that the next week she was completely asynchronous, completely not related to the teacher knowing what had happened. The teacher had said, okay, we're going to write some hero stories at school, and I'd like everyone to think about some time when they were a hero. Now, what I heard in the stories of the venturers last night was that everyone had a role, and there were students who were helping to give CPR for over 45 minutes. There were students who ran, venturers who ran to a nearby farmhouse. There were venturers who ran to meet an ambulance. So their disciplinary skills, those certain skills were put into a frame of probably the most uncertain and chaotic situation you could imagine for a child of 15 or 16 or 17, and that is a life and death situation. When this young woman was asked to write a hero story at school, of course she wrote about a bird, and she wrote a story which was more metaphorical than the actual situation. But she had shared with the mum that, well, I couldn't write about my own story, my own hero story, because he died, because the leader had died. So I wasn't a hero because I wasn't a success. So I give this story as a collective story of common humanity, but also a story that leads me to round up with these questions for us. What does the cult of success look like? And again, I'm drawn back into lived experience here of a pre-service educator saying to me, well, what does success look like for the student? We have to tell them first what success looks like. Can we ask instead a different kind of cult where we might ask, what was intended? What emerged? What was the insight? And what's next? How might we move or shift or transform from institutional thinking to systems thinking in this kind of way? How might we move, shift, transform from ego-logical thinking, again drawing from Beghetto, to ecological thinking? And from being the centre of the world to being part of a world. Now, our roles as adults in that space might be to encourage that young venturer that their assessment, their self-assessment, maybe needed some questioning in itself. That adulting for us as educators is the offer to perhaps see assessment differently. And of course, what does that mean safely for our students, culturally, individually, personally? How to be present and curious as the filmmaker of In My Blood, It Runs was and is, and was able to share with us in that discussion and that beautiful evocation of question making about education in that film. Okay, so thanks everyone. I'll open it back to you, Robyn. And for those of you who are not aware, In My Blood It Runs, if you haven't come across it, documentary on ABC iView.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and certainly I recommend everybody watches In My Blood It Runs. It's certainly very thought-provoking. Marianne, I want to start. Well, I want to thank you for those questions. I think we could spend a lot of time in reflection on those questions that you've raised at the end there. But I want to take us back for a minute to pre-service teachers, because we've talked a lot about how we as teachers might create those uncertain times in the classroom. But for me, it's got to start with our pre-service teachers who, as Ron suggested at the beginning, might often be successful academically and therefore not comfortable with creativity and with uncertainty. And I'm just wondering how we might support them in their journey as they're learning to teach, to feel confident about taking risks themselves, not just encouraging their learners to take those risks, but to take risks and to feel confident about finding the questions instead of always thinking about in their heads what the next question will be.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Robyn, and it's one that that we worked quite a lot, I guess, in trying to find a way in which the educators themselves first engage with the arts as learners. So
Yes.
enabling them opportunities to have and in fact, we ask or invite our pre-service educators in our program at UTAS to become learners themselves first. Like, so what does it mean to engage in the arts without a self-assessment of their capacities? Because the tragedy is often when we ask pre-service educators to reflect on their experience of the arts, we find that there is so much negative arts experience in childhood, and people have been carrying that for a very long time. And this is the question of assessment is a human question as much as it is an educational question, because the way in which those pre-service educators are judging their capacity and judging their capabilities based on previous experience kind of is an opportunity to work with them. And of course, the arts is the first step for us. So that's opportunity. I think someone mentioned the word failure doesn't even kind of enter into that space for the first, particularly for the first half of our work with pre-service educators in these units and work in arts education to enable that comfort, to raise a kind of new normal about working the arts as being engaging, experimental and embodied prior to wrapping around the scaffolding to do that.
Yeah, and I immediately think about giving them places and spaces to play, I guess.
Absolutely, and play is very central to that.
Marianne, Robyn Carmody asks, I'm just wondering if the process of being present in cultivating the conditions of uncertainty is what foundation teachers do when facilitating purposeful play. Certainly that leads on from what Robyn was just alluding to. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess and it comes back to kind of worry and play. It's very difficult to play when you're worried. And so that opportunity for teachers to kind of cultivate, and again, this is the gift of Ron's work, I think, around having a scaffold or a schema about how we might engage with learning encounters that have a determined, some predetermined aspect to it, but at the same time offering the play within that and the opportunity for purposeful play to be in the moment with the teaching. And that's those kind of in the moments where our teachers, when we were researching with them with Curious Schools, it's the aha moments that they would have with their students. And rather than teaching them to have teaching them how to cultivate the conditions for students themselves to have those aha moments, to be present in the learning at that moment.
Don't forget, if you have a question, to feed it through the chat line. Here's a question from Ron. He thanks you, first of all, Marianne, for so many wonderful ideas to reflect on and the beautiful poem that you shared with us at the beginning. Ron is turning to that question of assessment and suggests the what if question. What if we return to the Latin origins of the term assessment, which means to sit beside? How might this establish a new normal if we took this original definition seriously in our work with young people?
Oh, absolutely, Ron. I think that this is our what's next. I feel in much of our ways of working creatively within the systems that we are currently working. So how might we, with pre-service educators and with our colleague teachers, be looking at what does assessment where you're sitting beside or sitting with, what does that look like? And it's a little bit like that kind of wonderful schemata of mundane uncertainty, profound uncertainty, and actual uncertainty in the middle. What might, there is students setting the criteria, there is predetermined criteria, but what sits in the middle as a sitting with? Because the question making that a virtuosic educator can bring, the question making that a virtuosic artist can bring, is what sits in the middle, what sits as a learning with and are sitting beside, because that opportunity to still open up those something you haven't thought about before is absolutely important, I think, in that process. Yeah, for me, it's the what's next.
Thanks, Marianne. That's kind of a really good way to tie your work and Ron's work together. I kind of just one final question. If you think about your reflections and Ron's reflections on creativity in schools, what are the things, if you could do them, if you had control, what are the things that you would do to change schools to make them more like the sitting beside assessment, more like uncertainty, more like dealing with ambiguity? What are the changes you'd make, and perhaps what are the changes that teachers could make in their classrooms tomorrow that you can think of?
Yeah, it's a great question, because often we get overwhelmed, don't we? I mean, the idea of transforming schools is can sometimes be a massive task, a bit like addressing a pandemic change society that we need to, I guess, localize and understand our context. And when I say localize, that context can be a classroom or an actual school, and to enable people to feel safe in asking the questions of what does it mean for their school? How do we support principals and leadership teams in schools to sit with, to do some of that kind of sitting with assessment that Ron mentions there, and to also recognise the creativity and the strengths that are already kind of flourishing in a school, and to enable them to grow with that, with those strengths into some question making about what's right here, right now, and how we transform the system, the ecological thinking of our classroom. How can we change or transform the ecological class, the ecosystem of our school in this as well? So they're kind of philosophical questions, but I think it's philosophy in action, which can then be translated and transformed into the little practices, the big ideas and the little practices that are actually sustainable in terms of transforming a school, and working within the necessary constructs that we are at the moment.
We have a question from Vanessa Chappell. Thank you, Vanessa. And it's taking us to reflection.
Yeah.
Is there an opportunity for pre-service teachers to engage in ongoing self-reflection, knowing, body somatic listening, ancestry, lineage, understanding their own mechanistic enculturation from an experiential place?
Yes, I mean, Vanessa, I think this is our, this is again, what's next, or what's now, what's needed now in terms of, I know at UTAS we're working through our Indigenising curriculum, for example, around enabling scaffolded opportunities for students to enable, and this is students right across the board, not just in education, to enable, for example, having worlding experiences on country with elders and community here in Tasmania, as a way not only to learn about history, but to walk with the many ways of knowing that are possible in a university education, not just those that have been predetermined and pre-prescribed as being kind of academic knowledge. And I think central to that is the ways in which self-reflection, listening, understanding of one's own ancestry and lineage becomes a foundation for learning. So I think beyond pre-service teachers, it's right across, I think, our educational landscape, in Australia particularly, to sit with the discomfort of what it means to have been a one-way knowing in our schooling system and in our university system. So there are opportunities. There's a necessity, but there are opportunities, Vanessa, around the country, I think, and we have to keep kind of naming it up and keep walking with those opportunities.
Marianne, this will be our last question for today. It comes from Charles Bisley. Children will often take risks with each other that they won't take by themselves. Is that because the encounter, the relational learning, makes the risk worth taking? The learning between, the sitting beside? So it's really a question about, I think, collaboration and being together. Does that make risk-taking more possible, more able to engage with?
I guess it comes down to that, one of those differences between risk and uncertainty, which is my understanding of risk kind of from a philosophical perspective and an applied perspective, is that a risk is taken when you can calculate the outcome. So there might be a set of outcomes which it's possible to assess, to evaluate, and the risks might be kind of rationally known. But as Ron invites us to think about, you know, uncertainty is really about not having some of those maps in front of us already. So I think that children will often take some of those risks when they're not, when they are actually kind of sharing the risks with others, because the implications or the kind of outcomes will be ones that that they are able to also then share together and to understand differently together as well.
Thanks, Marianne. And we had a great interlude from your cat, which has become a bit of a
I
Zoom.
did notice that.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. You know, talk about sitting in uncertainty. It's been quite a morning here in the
Bit of a Zoom trope. Yeah, a bit of a Zoom trope, the old cat in the background.
Oh,
but thank you so much for those reflections.